Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. Welcome back to Gran Turismo's most memorable cars, the semi-regular series where I dive into the back catalogue to bring you some interesting and obscure stories about some of the many cars that have appeared in these games. Now, I've already covered a lot of cars throughout the previous 4 episodes, 40 to be exact, but such is the depth on offer that we've still barely scratched the surface. Today, we're diving back into the realm of cars that became well known in these games for reasons the developers didn't anticipate. One of my personal favourite topics when it comes to Gran Turismo. Along these lines, I've talked about cars that have become memes, and ones that have even gained infamy within the fanbase. But now we're looking at another variation on this theme, cars with strange claims to fame. These are models that stand out thanks to certain unique traits they have in these games, usually in relation to specific features or design decisions. However, as time has gone on, some of these points have faded into the background, becoming a piece of interesting trivia, but nothing more. That's where I come in, as in this video we're going to dig deeper into these quirks, seeing what impact they really have, and how they came about in the first place. There are even a couple of unsolved mysteries for us to sink our teeth into. If I were to ask you to name a feature that was brought to the series with Gran Turismo 5, there are quite a few options that you could pick, but the one that this entry centers around is paint chips. A bit of background first. From Gran Turismo 1 to Gran Turismo 4, you weren't able to repaint your car. If you bought it from new, you could choose the initial color, but once you took ownership of it, you were stuck with that color forever. That was until GT5, where the feature made its long-awaited debut. However, the implementation of this was anything but conventional. The way it worked was that when acquiring a car, you would earn a paint chip of the color you got it in. This paint chip could then be used as a token to repaint a car or even just its wheels in that same color. Bear in mind that this paint chip system was the only way to repaint cars in this game, as it wasn't paired with a more traditional paint selection system like we have now in GT7. Paint chips, like many things in GT5, were controversial, as it did address one major complaint from the previous games, but not in a way that fully satisfied most players. What made it worse was that paint chips were one-use items, making them a very valuable commodity, but they were made reusable in GT6. For all of its issues, paint chips did add a new dimension to the collection aspect of Gran Turismo, because what it meant was that certain cars became more desirable purely thanks to the colours they came in. For some cars, it was because of the specific colours they had, and others through the sheer amount of them. The first generation Dodge Charger RT had a whopping 31 paint chips on offer. Now, I don't know this for certain, but I'm 99% sure this is the most of any car in GT5, and in GT6 it was matched only by the Dino 246. For many people, TVR had some of the most interesting colours out there. Not only did cars like the Tuscan Speed 6 have a massive selection of colours, 22 in total, but they included some iridescent or colour shift paints, like Reflex Purple and Reflex Spice. Having these radical factory paint colours is something that TVR was known for in the real world. However, if there is one car that's been almost entirely defined by its paint chips, I think there's only one answer. The Toyota FT86 G Sports concept was first seen at the 2010 Tokyo Auto Salon. It was essentially a factory-tuned version of the Toyota FT86, the concept that would go on to become the GT86. But in spite of its aggressive looks and decent performance, that isn't what most people remember it for in these games. Because in the car's only appearances in GT5 and 6, it comes in 9 different colours, all of which are iridescent. Of course, whether you actually like these colours or not is entirely subjective, but the main point is that they were all totally unique paint chips that were only really comparable to the handful of similar ones from TVR. To me, this makes the FT86 G Sports the most desirable car from a paint chip perspective, something which I can vouch for personally, as I remember spending 4.5 million credits to buy the car in all 9 colours in GT6 back in the day. For paint chip collectors, this car was truly a gift. However, something you've probably not really thought about before is, why does this car come in these colours? They're clearly not factory Toyota paints. You see, whenever the real car was shown off, it was always painted in plain white with some red decals. This was also how the car was depicted in GT5 initially, as we can see from this trailer and early screenshots. However, when the game released in November, it was replaced with the polarized paints instead. The biggest clue actually comes from the names of the colours themselves. Mazziora is a type of iridescent paint that was developed by Nippon paint and used mainly for cars. Fun fact, you know Team Impul, the guys that ran the memorable Calsonic-sponsored Nissans in Super GT for many years? Well, in 1998, they were sponsored by Maziora in Formula Nippon, with their cars painted accordingly. But aside from cars, their paints also have many other applications, from musical instruments to railway locomotives, and even a special Maziora edition of the Sega Dreamcast in 1999. But anyway, the point is that in Japan, Maziora is a fairly well-known brand. The colours that we see on the FT86 make up two different lines of paint. Maziora Everest, McKinley and Matterhorn are from the Alps collection, whereas Mazaran, Safer, Trapezium, Pleiades 2, Andromeda and Andromeda 2 make up the Cosmo collection. They're all very real paints that you can purchase off the shelf and use for whatever you want to. As for why they appeared on this car in GT5 and 6, that's hard to say. Not only does it seem like the car was never actually shown in any of these colours in real life, there doesn't seem to be any mention of Maziora in any press release or statement about the car. It's worth noting that Maziora has partnered with OEMs before, including even Toyota themselves for a special edition of their BB City car. So if Toyota did have some sort of partnership with Maziora for the FT86 G Sports, it seems like it was entirely exclusive to Gran Turismo. But although this car was never actually painted in these colours in real life, plenty of other cars have been. And thanks to the paint chips, this is also true in Gran Turismo. If I had to guess, I would say that more people have spent time driving a car painted in one of these colours in these games than they have driving the actual car they came from. Well, from a car tied to a feature that debuted in GT5, we take a step back to the previous game. One of the new additions to Gran Turismo 4 was A-Spec points. Essentially, up until this game, there was no way to gauge the actual performance of your car versus your opponents. The best you would have is maybe a rough horsepower estimate. A-Spec points was Gran Turismo's first attempt to address this. The points themselves were calculated based on the average performance of your AI opponents, minus the performance of your own car, plus 60 points. The points would be on a scale of 1 to 200. 1 point indicated that the race would be a walkover, whereas 200 meant that you were in for a world of pain. At least that was the idea. Of course, for any of these calculations to work, this means that there needs to be some sort of rating system for the cars themselves behind the scenes, and GT4 does have one. Although, as it was their first attempt, it's not the best. And there is one vehicle in particular that really highlights this. In terms of cars, GT4 was the first game to feature full-sized pickup trucks, and it's the heaviest of these heavyweights that really shows the cracks. The Dodge Ram weighs almost 2,400 kilos and has 340 horsepower. It's clearly not the fastest thing out there, but is still capable of some performance. However, if you try to use it in pretty much any race, you'll always end up seeing the same thing: 200 A-Spec points. For whatever reason, the Ram is extremely underrated in the point system. In arcade mode, where the game tries to match you with cars of similar performance, you will almost exclusively see K-cars, small compacts, and classics, all of which the Ram can easily destroy, even if the game insists that it can't. Let's put this into some context. In terms of how the Ram is rated behind the scenes, in its stock form it's roughly equivalent to a Fiat Panda, a car that weighs 730 kilos but has only 44 horsepower. Just from saying that, you can tell it's already massively off. But if we then calculate a rough horsepower per ton figure, it really underlines the imbalance. In fact, the Ram is actually the 15th lowest ranked normal vehicle in the entire game. So, how did this happen? Well, of the normal vehicles that could be raced in GT4, the Ram is definitely the heaviest. In that case, I would just be tempted to say that the problem is they weighted the rating system too far in favour of lightness, with power not being enough of a factor to make up the difference. However, if we look at the other heavyweight vehicles, we can see that's not the case. Take the Chevrolet SSR. It's another pickup truck with similar specs to the Ram, 289 horsepower and 2,248 kilos. Despite it having a slightly worse power to weight ratio, it's actually a bit faster than the Ram, and if you try to use it in arcade mode, you'll see much tougher opponents that actually justify the 200 A-Spec points. In terms of the ranking, the SSR is actually rated dead even with the Lotus Elise and Toyota Corolla Aero Tourer. If we again do a rough weight versus power calculation, we can see that they're much closer competitors. In fact, this shows that the SSR is probably slightly overrated in this system. So, as for why the Ram is so underrated, that's still a mystery. You would imagine that they had some sort of rough calculation to work out their rankings, so the only possibilities are that either the data for the Ram was entered incorrectly, or never entered at all and they just completely winged it for some reason. Well, regardless of the reasoning, the effects of this are clear. What it means is that arcade mode races with it are incredibly easy, even if you turn the difficulty up to 10. And in GT mode, using the RAM is the best way to win 200-point races. Of course, the irony of this is that A-Spec points don't actually do anything in GT4, but there is still some sense of achievement in earning them. Of course, if we look at the PS3 games onwards, A-Spec points would be replaced by performance points. Now, the performance point system has always been exploitable, but it's still a lot more accurate than its predecessor. For example, here on GT6, the RAM is rated at 410 pp, but the Fiat Panda, which was supposedly slightly better than it in GT4, is rated at 277. These numbers make a lot more sense. GT6 would end up being the RAM's final official appearance in the series so far, but it still retains an overlooked presence in these games. If you load up GT7 and head to a track like Northern Isle Speedway, you can find scenery vehicles that appear to be the very same Dodge Ram. It's almost like we're being haunted by it from beyond the grave. Much like the Ram, our next entry is a car that's appeared in multiple games, but exhibits a weird trait in GT4 specifically. This time we're on the total other end of the performance spectrum. In GT4, you can filter the prototype race cars into two main categories. The first are the outright fastest cars, generally made up of high-power Group C machines like the Sauber C9, Nissan R89C and R92CP, and of course, the legendary Toyota Minolta. These are cars with over 900 horsepower that are almost guaranteed to be the fastest opponents in any event they appear. However, they do have an Achilles heel: tire wear. And this is where our second category comes in. This group is made up of prototypes that aren't quite as powerful as those in category 1, but as a result, don't wear out their tires as quickly. As such, there are many occasions where you'll actually find these cars to be your nearest challengers, such as the Audi R8s, the Pescarolo C60s, and Mazda 787B. However, possibly the best example of this type of opponent can be seen at the Super Speedway 150 miles endurance race. The Peugeot 905 is a car that's only in international versions of GT4, but if you encounter it in this event, you will notice. It is the only opponent car that can do the entire race on a single pit stop. So although there will likely be faster opponents, this is the car you really have to beat if you want to win. In fact, it's so good that you may be tempted to get one yourself, but if you do, you're in for a nasty surprise. The Peugeot 905 is notorious for having extremely slow gear shifts. In the lower gears in particular, it is simply agonizing. For a car that supposedly represents cutting-edge performance, albeit in 1992, it is kind of absurd. Needless to say, in real life this wasn't the case. The car was fitted with a state-of-the-art 6-speed sequential transmission, meaning that it was able to shift about as fast as any other car it raced against. The Group C rules in those final years meant that the cars were basically Formula 1 machines with more bodywork. So the usual questions are how and why. Well, for that first part, we do have a concrete answer, but just a warning, it's gonna get a bit nerdy. The speed at which a car changes up a gear is determined by two factors in GT4, its flywheel inertia stat and its engine braking stat. When a car changes up a gear, it drops down a certain amount of revs before engaging the next gear and then continuing to accelerate. Flywheel inertia determines how quickly it drops down the revs, whereas engine braking determines how many revs it actually drops. By using SpecDB, the internal car database of GT4, we can see exactly what's going on. Whilst the 905 has a flywheel inertia stat that's roughly similar to other comparable race cars, its engine braking stat of 122 leaves a lot to be desired. The higher the engine braking stat, the better, so when you see other prototypes with figures like 250, that says everything you need to know. For comparison, the 905's engine braking stat is roughly equivalent to the Mark V Golf GTI. But it gets worse, because most road cars like the Golf can have clutch and flywheel upgrades which improve these stats and therefore shift times. Being a top-end race car, the 905 cannot, and is simply always stuck with these agonizing upshifts. As for the why, just like every other stat listed here, there's no way to know the rationale behind them. Maybe it was a mistake and they meant to put 222 instead, or it was an entirely intentional decision. Either way, we have no way of knowing. For GT5, the car was modified to have much faster gear shifts, in line with its rivals, and that was that. For as much as I've highlighted its gear changes here, I have to say that when you look beyond that, I think the 905 is actually a really great car in GT4. It's fairly easy to drive for a prototype. Personally, I think think it handles like a dream, and as I've mentioned, its long tire life is a major plus point. Also, there are ways to combat its prolonged upshifts. One is to simply avoid using lower gears, which are the worst affected. This reduces the amount of times you have to change gear over a lap, and using higher gears also reduces wheel spin and therefore tire wear. If you want to, you can even bring the gear ratios closer together to improve things across the board. You know, everyone has a favourite Group C car from these games, and if I'm being honest, mine is the 905. Despite being a 2-time Le Mans winner, I kind of feel like it gets forgotten about. I really do hope it comes back to Gran Turismo one day, because it was a very cool car that was simply dealt a bad hand in its first appearance in this series. Speaking of cars that were dealt a bad hand, I don't think it gets much worse than this next case. We once again head over to Gran Turismo 5 for this slice of weirdness. Now, seeing as I've already made a video discussing this topic in depth, there's no need to beat around the bush. Standard cars. The ported over PS2 and PSP models that appeared in the PS3 games alongside their higher fidelity counterparts, dubbed as premium cars. Yep, I'm gonna say it again, this was a very controversial decision in GT5. Whilst it did help to bolster up the car roster to over 1,000 models, you can't deny that they were an eyesore. The biggest offender here were the textures. Things like headlights and taillights, as well as any livery designs, just looked plain awful. Of course, by PS2 standards they were fine, but GT5's updated game engine really exposed their issues. There were numerous, almost countless examples of standard cars that just looked out of place, but there was one that stood head and shoulders above them as the de facto worst looking standard car in GT5. And if we take a look at the thumbnail of that video I made in October 2023, it all becomes very clear. This is the Suzuki Alto Works Limited, a car that originally debuted back in Gran Turismo 2, but it was in GT5 where it suddenly grabbed attention, mainly down to this screenshot that went viral not long after the game release. I mean, I have to assume that if you're watching this video, then you're blessed with the ability of sight, so I don't really need to describe why this car looks so bad, but I'll do it anyway. For one, it has hideous textures as we mentioned. The grey decal along the side is particularly nasty, but something that is uniquely wrong about it is the actual quality of the model. Now, most standard cars were guilty of having jagged edges in places, but this Alto takes things to a whole new level. Just look at the headlights, the wheel arches and the windows. It's almost in an entirely different league when it comes to visuals. Now, as much as I would love to clown on this car even more, there is an important point that has to be mentioned. When GT5 first released, some of the standard car models ended up being slightly distorted. This Alto was one of them, and as a result, it actually looked better in GT4 than it did initially in GT5. However, with the version 1.06 update, these issues were rectified, and so the Alto looked marginally better, particularly at the front. Sadly, this is all the attention the car would ever receive. Despite Polyphony gradually updating more and more standard cars during the PS3 era, to the point where some could even be considered semi-premium, the Alto stayed exactly like this through to the end of GT6. You would think that given it was very quickly singled out as the worst standard car, they would have spent a little bit of time tidying it up. But as they've proven on many occasions, Polyphony aren't exactly the most in touch with their community. As such, this Alto was just left to be the butt of every standard car joke. Now, there's a couple of interesting things about the Alto that I want to point out. One that often gets forgotten is that this car actually has a duplicate model, the Alto Works RSZ. It's pretty much identical to the Limited, but minus the front lip and rear spoiler. In that case, how come this model rarely ever gets seen when it comes to the standard car discussion? Well, one reason is that it doesn't have the horrific looking stripe, but the second actually comes down to its colour. Ever notice that when the Alto is brought up, you tend to see it in white? This is because white creates a bigger contrast and so shows up the issues even more. The RSZ isn't available in white, so naturally the problems with its model don't stand out as much. Of course, we can then flip this around. The only other colour you can get the Limited in is black, and it looks significantly better because it hides a lot of the flaws. In fact, repainting this car to any colour other than white is bound to improve its appearance. Now, last year I made a video where I covered every single time a Gran Turismo game was delayed. And as part of researching for that video, I stumbled across something quite interesting. When Gran Turismo 4 Prologue was first announced in late 2003, they shared a number of high-resolution renders of the various cars that would be in the game, and one of them was the Alto. However, what caught my attention was how bad the Alto's model looked even back then. Seriously, when compared to models that were also carried over from GT3, it just looked so janky. And that made me realise something. The Alto's model has always sucked. It's just because of the lower resolution of the PS2 games that we never really noticed until GT5. Of course, when playing these PS2 games on an emulator with higher resolution, these issues become much more apparent. In GT3, the only car that really comes close to it is the Daihatsu Mira/Kuore. It too suffers from being very rough around the edges, particularly on the wheel arches and windows, and it was only these renders that made me realise that. I don't imagine it's a coincidence that two of the worst looking cars in GT3 are also the only two K cars in the entire game. Of the two, the Alto does still look noticeably worse though, and it's worth noting that the Mira was one of the cars that was improved considerably in the PS3 era. It even earned semi-premium status within the community. If it was possible for that car, I have truly no idea why they left the Alto to suffer the fate that it did. The Chaparral 2J is a car that every Gran Turismo fan knows about to some degree. Everything about it is just so unorthodox. From its looks, to its method of generating downforce, to even the number of gears, nothing was done by the book. And given that it was outlawed from the Can-Am series it competed in after just a handful of winless races, it remains as one of racing's great what-ifs. Within the realm of Gran Turismo, the 2J debuted in GT4, instantly catching the attention of anyone who came across it. Not only was it very striking to look at, but it also had the performance to back it up. This car can hold its own against the fastest prototypes in the game, benefiting from good traction which also helps with tyre wear. In pretty much any event this car appeared as an opponent, you knew that you had a challenge. Notable examples include the All-American Championship in GT4 and GT5, as well as the historic Racing Car Cup in the latter. For what was essentially a vintage race car, its speed was incredible. But then we come to Gran Turismo 6. Now, whilst everything I've said about the 2J so far is still true in this game, it managed to add an interesting new dimension. In GT6, some cars were able to achieve high speeds in reverse. These were mostly electric vehicles, such as the Tesla Roadster, which makes sense, given that in theory, this car can achieve the same speeds going backwards by just reversing the direction of the electric motor. A quirk of the 2J as a combustion engine car is that as well as having 3 very long forward gears, its reverse gear is also unusually stretched. In GT4, you can make it go 126 miles an hour in reverse straight from the box. However, that is nothing compared to GT6. With some fairly basic tuning, including a Stage 3 turbo kit and a transmission flip, which I'll explain in a bit, this car can be propelled to well over 200 miles an hour facing in the wrong direction. The exact tune I'm using here comes courtesy of Schmo GT, and I'll leave it linked in the description if you want to try it yourself. Now, given that we're operating on one gear, it does take a while to get up to speed, but at a track like Special Stage Route X, we have plenty of space. However, even at a track as simple as this one, we still face some challenges in trying to complete a full lap, that being the 2 massive banked corners on either end of the circuit. So this is where the second part of the tune comes in. This all involves making the car as stable as possible through suspension and differential settings. But the most important factor is the tyres. What you want to do is set the front tyres to racing soft, the grippiest tyres in the game, and the rears to comfort hard, the least grippy. Under normal circumstances, this would make the car a complete mess to drive, given that power goes to its rear wheels, but when in reverse, it helps to lock it into a stable trajectory while still allowing some steering movements. This means that with some careful control, you can get around these corners no problem. In GT6's career mode, there is one single race that takes place at Route X, and it's found in Like the Wind. This race is against some of the fastest cars in the game, but the 2J is capable of making them all look like complete chumps. Is there anything better than being able to look directly at your opponents as you leave them in the dust? But with this race, we can push the 2J even further. These older games are notorious for having an extremely overpowered slipstream effect, and if we take advantage of that here, this car can reach over 300 miles an hour. That puts it just behind some of the outright fastest cars in the entire game, all whilst going backwards. The 2J would return in GT7, but sadly it's not capable of the same trick. It really was just a GT6 special. But whilst we're on the topic of reverse driving, did you know that reverse drifting was also a thing in this game? Sadly, the 2J isn't capable of doing this as well, although I've never actually seen anyone try it. So, the 2J is the king when it comes to high-speed reverse driving, but there was another car that almost took its crown. In Gran Turismo Sports, the tuned Chevy Nova was also capable of hitting incredible speeds in reverse. Just like the 2J, this was mainly thanks to a transmission flip, which is where you set the auto setting to as high as possible, then also put the final gear as high as it'll go, before going back to the auto setting, which glitches the gears and allows them to be set even lower than normally possible. If you then put the final gear all the way to the left, this results in insanely long gears, which also includes reverse. By doing this, the Nova can also get to over 200 miles an hour going backwards, but it's still some way off the 2J. As I've said, even without this exploit, the 2J was already a very unique and memorable car. It really speaks volumes about it when the fact that it was able to go 300 miles an hour in reverse has just become an often forgotten side note. In a video like this, I always try to save the best for last, and boy, do I have an interesting tale for you all. If I were to ask you what the first fictional car, i.e. a car that was never actually made in real life, to ever appear in this series was, what would you say? Some would jump to Vision Gran Turismo for the answer. Vision GT is a collaboration between Gran Turismo and various car manufacturers that started back in 2013 to create unique concept cars to feature in these games. In most cases, these cars were either never made in real life or only exist as physical mock-ups. However, if we jump back another decade, we can find something else. I think a good number of you would say that the first fictional car in Gran Turismo must be the Nike 1 that was first seen in GT4. It was designed in partnership between Nike and Gran Turismo to create their idea of a car of the future, that future now being 3 years ago. In some ways, it was the first ever Vision GT car, long before the project actually began. However, the true answer to this question isn't as clear-cut as it might seem. Gran Turismo 2 brought many new manufacturers to this series for the first time, and one of them was Tomy Kaira. This brand rose to prominence as a tuning company throughout the late 80s and into the 90s, and in 1995 they even developed their own in-house sports car, the ZZ. This car is very real, with over 200 examples being produced, and I even talked about it before in a previous video in this series. But the same can't be said for its potential successors that also appeared in GT2, the ZZ2 and the ZZ3. Counterintuitively, we're going to start with the ZZ3 first. I guess I'll get straight to the point here. There is no evidence to suggest that the Tomy Kaira ZZ3 actually existed in real life. There are no records to show that it was actually made, and no proof of it ever being seen, whether that be on video or just photos. As far as anyone can tell, this car only ever existed in GT2. However, unlike the Nike 1 or any of the Vision GTs, this car was not a concept designed in collaboration with Gran Turismo. It was intended to be made as a real car. Its description in GT2 makes this very clear, as well as highlighting some of the ZZ3's theoretical features. What's fascinating is that this small piece of text is some of the only information about this car anywhere on the internet. In fact, I would be tempted to say that this car was just one big joke that Polyphony came up with just to mess with everyone, if it weren't for one crucial piece of evidence. There exists an image taken from a Japanese magazine that shows a concept drawing of the ZZ3, albeit with slightly different proportions from the version in GT2. Outside of the game, this is the only proof I can find of this car actually being in development. I guess the question then is whether the car we see in GT2 is based solely on these drawings, or if Polyphony was privy to more information. From looking at the car in GT2, it seems to have similar proportions to the ZZ, and is also very close in spec. Does this mean that the ZZ3 was intended to be heavily based on the ZZ, or did Polyphony just make that assumption based on a lack of available information? Either way, I think it's pretty fascinating that this car ended up in the game at all. One interesting point is that the car description I showed you earlier was removed from the PAL version of GT2 that came out in January 2000, instead replaced by the same description from the ZZ. Does this imply that by that time the ZZ3 project was already dead? It's entirely possible. It's worth mentioning that there are rumours that the ZZ3 morphed into the ASL Garaya, which itself would also appear in Gran Turismo starting in GT4. However, although it's true that ASL essentially took over Tomy Kaira's sports car division in 2001, I can't find any concrete evidence to confirm that beyond just hearsay. In discussing the ZZ and the ZZ3, we're obviously ignoring the missing link, the ZZ2. Much like the original ZZ, it would also go on to reappear in the series from GT3 all the way through to GT6. However, when you compare this version of the car to the version from GT2, you will notice something. They look completely different. As you can probably guess, this means there's another interesting story to tell here. With the ZZ being killed off prematurely in 2000, Tomy Kaira was looking to go bigger with their next project. What they envisioned was essentially a road-going GT race car that could be bought off the shelf and then ran in various championships with only minor modifications. The car could be fitted with various different engine configurations depending on which category it was competing in. This initial concept of the car is the version we see depicted in GT2, featuring a very low and aggressive profile as well as a large detached rear wing. However, as time went on, the car would eventually morph into something else entirely. Just a couple of years later, the ZZ2 would be officially unveiled in its new form. This version was no longer a hardcore track-focused car, but instead a more refined high-performance sports car. It was powered by the RB26DETT from the Nissan R34 GTR, but with many modifications that brought power to around 550 horsepower. It also utilized the Atessa system from the GTR, making it all-wheel drive, compared to the previous design which only powered the rear wheels. Only one model of the ZZ2 was ever made, however this isn't actually what the version we see in Gran Turismo is based on. You see, the ZZ2 was officially unveiled at the Tokyo Auto Salon in January 2002, but Gran Turismo 3 released some 8 months earlier. How is this possible? Simple, the car we see in GT3 is actually based on the 1/5 scale clay model of the finalized design that was created prior to the actual car itself. What this means is that the ZZ2 we see from GT3 onwards has some differences from the real thing. For example, it lacks the front indicators which the real car took from a Toyota Celica, and it also has different side mirrors. The ones on the real car were sourced from an Audi TT. This also explains why it's listed in-game as a 2000 model year, since the design it's based on was finalized in December 2000. Polyphony would never remodel the ZZ2, so this is the way it stayed all the way until GT6 in 2013. It has to be mentioned that this car is also considered to be one of the most overpowered cars in Gran Turismo. It has supercar levels of performance, and yet only costs about 60,000 credits in the PS3 games. It was also known for being incredibly good in GT6 when it came to performance point limited events, often dominating seasonal event leaderboards. So that's the story of the ZZ2 in Gran Turismo, but if we take a look back to the version in GT2, we're left with similar questions to the ZZ3. As this version of the car was a rear-wheel drive GT, and the version that was actually made was essentially an R34 GTR in the form of a mid-engine supercar, the only thing they really share is the name. So again, did the version seen in GT2 ever exist? Well, unlike the ZZ3, there is a lot more information online about the ZZ2's development. The design of the car was done by Noriyuki Nishida from Design Apple, who formerly worked for racing car constructor Dome. Not only was he responsible for the styling of the car that was actually made, but he's also the man behind the original design. These drawings come from Design Apple and depict the car almost exactly as it appears in GT2. So, just like the ZZ3, it seems like this car was also based purely on drawings and never actually physically existed, right? Well, there is one small piece of evidence I found that may contradict this. Take a look at this picture. Now, whilst it isn't a perfect match with the car from GT2, it does share many details, including the front-end design and headlights, side and roof air intakes, and a rear wing. To me, this car almost looks like a cross between the two versions of the ZZ2. Its styling generally mirrors the GT2 version, but its more toned-down road car aesthetic seems to imply that it's following the ethos of the car from GT3 onwards. I've considered the possibility that this is some sort of render, but looking at the details, I just can't believe that it is. If it is real, then this is most likely the only picture of the original design ZZ2 anywhere on the internet. The earliest posting of this image I can find is from a French forum in June 2004, but it was also later posted to Yoshikazu Tomita's personal blog in 2008. In case you don't know, he's the Tommy in Tomy Kaira. For what it's worth, I scoured the entirety of his blog to try and find any new information about this photo and the car pictured in it, but aside from confirmation that this is supposed to depict the ZZ2, there simply isn't anything. So assuming it is real, the questions we really need answers to are, what what is this car, and where did this picture even come from? Unless someone asked Tomita personally, I don't think we're gonna get any closer to the truth anytime soon. But mysteries like these only add to the mystique of these cars. In an era where everything is so thoroughly documented, cases like these are almost kind of refreshing. Tommy Kaira as a brand clearly didn't have the biggest presence in Gran Turismo, but if you ask me, they definitely had one of the most fascinating.